When World War I began, aviation was barely a decade old. As the warring sides collided and became entrenched in immovable trench warfare, the power and advantage of aerial reconnaissance were quickly discovered. Initially, balloons and then early airplanes were used for observing enemy positions and activities. Their intelligence significantly altered the course of several battles simply by providing armies with knowledge of the enemy's next move, allowing them to use this information against their adversaries. Subsequently, with the adjustment of artillery fire from the air and the denial of surprise to the enemy, the method of warfare was completely transformed. The significance of airplanes was quickly realized, and aviation began its frantically accelerated development. However, the path was not easy, marked by numerous failures and catastrophes. The first pilots showed us what real courage was, sometimes bordering on madness. So let's start from the very beginning. At the start, with no anti-aircraft guns or enemy fighter planes, the only and greatest danger for pilots was their own aircraft, though this would soon change. Once the importance of aerial reconnaissance was understood, the warring sides began to find ways to protect their troops in the trenches by preventing enemy aerial reconnaissance. Thus, the sky above the trenches took a dark and violent turn. Initially, as airplane engines barely had enough power to propel the aircraft and the pilot, it was impossible to carry any weapons. When enemy pilots met in the air, they even exchanged waves during their missions, but soon, this was no longer the case. With the gradual development of airplanes and their engines, pilots were now able to carry something with them in the hope of disabling the enemy. At first, these were weapons like flechettes, steel darts, or bricks to drop on the enemy. They even considered using grappling hooks on ropes to disable enemy aircraft. Then pistols and even rifles were used, some even successfully. However, a true revolution occurred with the installation of machine guns on airplanes. Initially, this was extremely difficult and cumbersome, as the machine gun would logically be placed directly in front of the pilot for accurate aiming, reloading, and clearing jams. But this way, it fired directly through the propeller arc, which was a dangerous proposition. After various strange and semi-successful attempts, including firing through the propeller in short bursts hoping not to hit the blades or reinforcing the blades to deflect bullets, the real revolution happened. Since the position of the machine gun in front of the pilot and using the airplane for aiming was the most efficient method, the only problem was the propeller in front of the machine gun. Then, a German system developed by Fokker solved this obstacle with a peculiar but highly effective invention, the synchronization gear. The machine gun and propeller were linked, and when the blade was in the line of fire, the mechanism interrupted the firing. When the blade was out of the line of fire, the machine gun fired normally. This made it safe and efficient to use, giving the Germans complete air superiority with only about 30 Fokker aircraft equipped with synchronized machine guns. In 1916, a new generation of faster and more maneuverable Allied fighters appeared, capable of challenging the Fokkers. The first among them was the Nieuport 11, a fast, small, single-seater biplane. It was faster, tougher, and more maneuverable than a Fokker, but still couldn't fire through the propeller. Instead, firing over the propeller from a machine gun mounted on the upper wing, the pilot had to somehow fly, shoot, and reload the machine gun simultaneously with only 2 hands. However, its superior speed and maneuverability allowed it to dominate the German Fokkers. Also, tactics changed, and instead of sending a single reconnaissance plane, the British began sending groups of 3 or 4 aircraft to hunt and destroy German planes. During the Battle of Verdun, brutal and close dogfights took place in the sky. One French pilot, for example, when his mechanic noticed that his helmet, goggles, and the upper part of his plane were covered in blood, and asked what had happened, simply replied, "I shot from very close." He was only 10 meters or 30 feet away when he fired 25 rounds into the crew of a German 2-seater that he shot down. Though they may sound and look glamorous when viewed from the ground, these aircraft were far from safe. Unreliable and fragile, made from a combination of lightweight wood covered with highly flammable material for increased aerodynamics, the flight itself was a sufficient danger. The fuel tank was located directly in front and above the pilot, and often leaked. Oil from the engine would spray into the pilot's face as well, and since they had no carburetor, pilots had to alternately turn the engine on and off during landing to slow down enough and maintain control of the aircraft. For a good part of the war, parachutes were not issued to pilots, and when they were heavy and cumbersome, effective only in 60% of cases. The open cockpit exposed pilots entirely to weather conditions and at high altitudes to dangerous oxygen deficiency, hypoxia. Most pilots carried pistols, not for the enemy, but for themselves. It was a quick way out if the plane caught fire, easing their suffering and saving them from the fate of burning alive. Some even jumped to their deaths for this reason. Can you even imagine the level of stress just to fly these machines, let alone fight in them? These battles weren't called dogfights for no reason. Fierce, close-quarters battles between aircraft trying to get behind one another and shoot when viewed from the ground resembled the aggressive and agile combat between dogs. Dogfights typically occurred at close range, often within a few hundred meters or less. Pilots relied heavily on visual spotting as there was no radar. This proximity meant engagements were fast and brutal, with pilots often having only a brief window to take their shot. Pilots employed various maneuvers to gain the advantage, such as the Immelmann turn for quick direction reversal and altitude gain, the split S for evading attacks and gaining speed, the scissors to force opponents to overshoot, and dive and zoom tactics to attack from above and regain altitude. One of the most effective tactics was attacking from the direction of the sun. By positioning their aircraft between the enemy and the sun, pilots could use the blinding glare to their advantage, making it difficult for the opponent to see the incoming attack. Pilots aimed to secure the altitude advantage, flying higher than their opponents. This position allowed them to dive on the enemy, using gravity to gain speed and increase the force of their attack. The tactic of dive and zoom involved diving on an enemy aircraft, firing, and then zooming back up to regain altitude, ready for another attack or to escape if necessary. As aerial combat evolved, pilots began flying in formations to provide mutual support. The Finger 4 formation, consisting of 4 aircraft arranged like fingers on an outstretched hand, became popular. This formation allowed pilots to cover each other's blind spots, making it harder for enemies to launch surprise attacks and providing better overall situational awareness. In close-quarters combat, pilots often engaged in turning fights, trying to outturn their opponent to get behind them and into a firing position. Tight turns, loops, and rolls were common maneuvers in these engagements. Effective pilots managed their aircraft's energy, speed, and altitude carefully. They avoided losing too much speed in tight maneuvers, which could leave them vulnerable to attack. Another tactic involved using offensive spirals, where a pilot would dive steeply while turning, making it difficult for the enemy to follow without risking a stall. This maneuver could shake off pursuers or set up a counterattack, as the pilot regained control and altitude. These tactics, combined with the skill and bravery of the pilots, defined aerial combat during World War I. As both sides adapted and countered each other's strategies, the skies became a dynamic and deadly battlefield, pushing the limits of early aviation technology and piloting skill. By the end of World War I, aviation had evolved from rudimentary reconnaissance missions to sophisticated aerial combat and strategic bombing. Pilots became crucial assets, even achieving hero status. During the interwar years, the lessons learned from World War I spurred rapid advancements in aviation technology. Nations invested heavily in developing more powerful engines, streamlined designs, and innovative weaponry, setting the stage for the dramatic aerial battles of World War II. In our next video, we'll dive into the evolution of military aviation during World War II, if that is something you would like to see.